Hello everybody, David Lindstedt here. Thank you so much for joining me. So glad to have you. We have a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and jump right in. Normally this is the point in the presentation where I say, hey, don't worry, it's not going to be too mathy. But Alexei said, well, you should make it mathy. So I'll try and strike a balance between interesting and continuing to capture your attention, and yet we will put some math in here because this is, after all, about measuring preparedness. So away we go. We need to talk first about what actually works in a post-disaster environment. There's no sense measuring, or as we've done pretty much for the last 25 years, counting things if they're not the right things to measure or count. So we're going to look very quickly, but somewhat thoroughly, at what works in a post-disaster environment. Then we'll talk about how to measure preparedness to deal with that post-disaster environment, and then we'll talk about some implications of what all this means. We're all in 30 to 40 minutes, so it's going to be drinking from the garden hose, if not a fire hose. Let's make sure we're talking about the right scope, though, because business continuity is its own body of knowledge. At least we better hope that it's its own body of knowledge, else it doesn't really provide any value. It should have its own value proposition. It is not the same as crisis management, emergency management, risk management, all the other managements out there, or cybersecurity or ITDR. It's its own subject matter expert. It's also not organizational resilience or resilience. That's a whole nother ball game, and I'm writing a book about that now. It's got its own body of knowledge and its own measures. Well, okay, what is this body of knowledge? What is business continuity? Well, at least for today, let's call business continuity the ability to recover and or continue services, right? We have business continuity presumably for a reason, and that reason is, hey, bad things happen, and while cybersecurity is running around fixing the intrusion or the ransomware, and ITDR is getting our server farm back up, and crisis management is talking to the public about what to do, and so on, people at the organization still need to deliver those services as best possible. So business continuity gets people ready to deliver, to continue to deliver services under adverse circumstances. What kind of adverse circumstances? You know, we'll talk more about that later, but it's going to be an uncontrolled physical building or resource or staffing loss. So for now, that's what we're talking about for business continuity. And then the question is, how do you measure that? A quick caveat, yes, there's too much text on these slides. That's fine. I'm not going to read them. They're for you to go back and reference later. So again, we need to talk about what actually works so that we know we're going to measure the right sorts of things. Quick caveat on that, there is so little research, it's incredible. There is very, very little information available on what organizations actually do in a post-disaster environment, what works, what's effective, to what degree, what things did they have in place that helped, what things did they have in place that did not make any difference. The research on business continuity and how to measure it, what are the right things that are actually efficient and effective in a post-disaster environment? Honestly, we don't know. What I'm going to propose is that we do have a way of finding out, but we don't have that data yet. One of the best resources of data on that is this book on the Christchurch earthquake. So we have some data and some research from Christchurch, some from Fukushima, some from Hurricane Katrina, and a whole wealth of new case studies, at least anecdotal evidence from COVID-19. That's the best that we have. I'll be referencing this book a little bit in our presentation. Well, what doesn't work, first of all? We need to think about that. Look, binders, documents, detailed instructions. This is shelfware. It's very clear from anecdotal evidence, case studies, and the research out there that doesn't work. Nobody grabs a big binder and goes through to page 20 302 and looks up, what do I do during a cybersecurity event? That's not how people operate in a post-disaster environment. Why do these exist in the first place? Well, it was largely the best we could think of. How does a risk manager measure or check the box that an organization is prepared to recover from disaster? Well, the best we can think of is, if you have at least thought of it, you probably have, if you have a long document, you've probably thought of it. If you've thought of it, that probably means you've somewhat prepared for it, and you're better off if you didn't have that document. This gets back to counting things, right? We've spent a lot of time in the last 25, 30 years counting documents, counting binders and plans, counting exercises, counting call trees, but not measuring. We're all driving this problem, and at the end of the presentation, I'm going to ask you to please help me stop, and let's move towards actual measuring. Well, look, why don't binders work? Well, there's a number of reasons, but one of which is that the post-disaster environment is incredibly complex. You have the history, experience, habits, culture, cognitive biases of each individual, and then the culture and the practices and the habits and responses and policies of each department. That's within an organization, obviously its own culture, the way of doing things, the policies, procedures, its customers. And as we move out and out and out, we have systems of intertwined, non-linear open systems. We have an environment that is literally impossible to conceive and understand and predict. We have these complex systems, all of which are interacting together, impossible to predict. And this is what we know from the work of Nicholas Taleb and others on fragile and black swans and anti-fragile. We cannot predict the future. We cannot say this is what's going to happen and these are going to be the impacts. We live in a complicated, clear, complex, and chaotic world. We live in a VUCA world. Most post-disaster situations are either chaotic or complex, and we hope that we can get them to the complex so that we can move them back towards complicated and clear. But the idea that we're going to predict exactly what's going to happen and be able to write plans to be able to address what's going to happen is out of the window. The future is unpredictable in those things that we want to predict in the first place. This was what we've seen with COVID-19 responses, right? In March of 2020, we didn't see a slew of articles saying, thank goodness we had binders and documents, some of which were left over from 2006 H5N1 pandemic flu planning. So that's not what helped. What helped were both a combination of crisis management, of crews and teams that came together to solve problems, and capabilities to be able to deal with a post-disaster situation. We'll talk more about that soon. We know that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. We know that it's the planning that matters, not the plan, and there are good reasons for that. So what does work? And I want to spend a very short amount of time here. Look, what matters and helps and assists in a post-disaster environment are the guiding principles. What are my decision-making parameters? How much money can I spend? How much authority do I have? What are my overall objectives? What are my overall guide rails and guardrails? What am I supposed to get done in a post-disaster environment, and how am I supposed to act? This is a high-level view that sets the parameters for making decisions and taking actions. And the only way, and we've seen this time and time again in post-disaster situations, particularly prolonged disaster situations, employees have to be empowered to be able to take action and make decisions. Even if it were desirable, which it isn't, for leaders to tell people what to do in a given bad situation, it's impossible. And so employees, the frontline people, and these are the people dealing directly with the problems, dealing with customers, stakeholders, shareholders, stockholders. They're the ones who can get a better handle of the situation in many cases. They're boots on the ground, their eyes on the ground, and they can be creative and innovative. They know payroll, they know accounting, they know accounts receivable, they know steam generation. They're the ones who have to be able to come up with the interesting, clever, resourceful, efficient ideas and experiments to get the organization through the problem. And so you've got to empower your employees for that. They have to be able to take action and make decisions. We have to have a situation where we have groups and crews of people coming together. They're assessing the situation. They're figuring out what has happened. They're trying multiple, inexpensive experiments to probe and sense the environment and say, what works? What doesn't work? How do I continue to offer payroll or accounting or steam generation or whatever it is under these adverse circumstances? And leaders and managers and directors have to care about their employees. Again, we've seen this with COVID-19 and in these prolonged disasters. Employees have to feel that they are cared for, that what they're doing matters. If there was a morale problem before the disaster, you can well imagine that the disaster is not going to make that better. Employees have to feel like what they're doing matters, particularly as they then have to care for the people they interact with. And that's not just family and friends, but it is family and friends, but also the customers, the shareholders, the callers, the emailers, everyone that they deal with is all facing a similar problem, or they're not. But either way, they've got to care for the employees. The alternative, lose them. Again, the research is very clear here. Around 50% of employees are at risk of leaving in a post-disaster situation. And if they don't feel cared for, if they don't feel appreciated, and we're seeing this, we saw this in the summer of 2021, where a lot of employees and leaders left their organization, even to take similar roles in a different organization, because they didn't feel appreciated for the sacrifices and the work that they put in to manage COVID-19. We're going to prepare for effects, not causes. There are probably literally a near infinite number of bad things that can happen. And as the open, nonlinear systems interact, what happens in those cases is unpredictable and probably unimaginable to some extent, certainly beforehand. So let's not try and think of every bad thing that's going to happen. For business continuity, remember, not talking about risk management here, business continuity. But let's prepare for the impacts, the outcomes. And what are the three big things that are going to happen in some combination is we're going to lose people, resources, and locations. And interestingly enough, I certainly don't fault people for not having a pandemic plan going into 2020. Because no one could have predicted how this pandemic was going to play out. But I certainly fault BC programs for not having preparations, and not plans, not documents, preparations for a loss of location. And interestingly, that's what we saw in 2020. Not a loss of people, which most of the 2006 pandemic plans had assumed would be the big problem in the pandemic. It was the loss of the locations. And business continuity programs should have had capabilities, preparedness, thoughts, ideas, and strategies for unavailability of locations. By the way, infrastructure matters, capital matters, and they're talking resource capital, intellectual capital, information capital, and relationship capital. Don't have time to go into a lot of these things. And what's important here is that business is becoming more agile, more design thinking, more DevOps, growth mindset, lean, motivation 3.0, Daniel Pink, Carol Dweck, atomic habits. The way that operations are operating now have more to do with the kind of environment where we would want to prepare people in these ways in the first place. It's going to be a lot more economically feasible and efficient and beneficial to set those guiding principles, to do these types of things. Capabilities, not documents. Guiding principles, not instructions or activities to do in a post-disaster environment. Innovation, not instructions, right? The creative, the innovative, the experiments that we're going to have to run in a post-disaster environment are not do these things in these order. It's going to require empowerment, creativity, innovation. It's going to involve certain capabilities, and we can grow and focus on those capabilities. So, how do we measure preparedness? So, knowing that these are the kinds of things that are effective in a post-disaster environment, how do we build them? How do we measure them? Remember, business continuity is about continuing or recovering services, following either individually or holistically, following an uncontrolled physical or staffing loss, and that means a loss of locations, resources, and people. So if those are the key ingredients in a post-disaster environment, that's where we need to start our measures. And if you think about what's needed in a post-disaster environment, first of all, we need resources, and that includes the people, the locations, and the stuff, the things, the resources, laptops and computers and MRIs and those things. We're going to need to know what to do, and that's not a list. It's not a detailed set of instructions. It's the guiding principles. It's the empowerment. It's the what we can do. And speaking of empowerment, the crisis competencies. People need to have the fortitude to be able to work through the disaster, to be empowered to make decisions, to have the tools that they need and the skills that they need and the competencies they need to be able to manage a post-disaster situation. So again, resources, everything from vital records and data and specimens and -80 freezers and NMRIs and plastic injection molding machines, whatever is needed to be able to recover from disaster, to continue those services. And for some places, internal audit, that's not going to be very much. For other places, the manufacturing floor, it's going to be quite a lot. Procedures. What does the HR department do in general following a disaster? How do they know what's happened? How do they know who to go to and what to do? Where do the people go to establish the location or set up a headquarters or assess the damage or work with the fire warden, get the information? Who's in charge of what kinds of things? What hats do they wear? How is this different from business as usual? Because it's probably very different from business as usual. What are the guiding principles? What are the overall objectives? What are the overall things they can do and they can't do? How do they get their arms around what's happened, and how do they start to reestablish all of their services? And they need the competencies to be able to do these things. They have to have the empowerment. They need to have innovation and creativity. They have to be able to make decisions. They have to have the fortitude to continue through these types of things. They have to be cared for. They have to have morale and a safe-to-fail environment where they can make little experiments to probe and sense what's going on and make the good decisions and try creative things. The best solutions are not going to be written down ahead of time. The best solutions are going to, if they come at all, emerge from this complex situation. So let's do a case study. Sorry, this is the right one. Let's do a case study of Frida and Department X. Imagine you're working with Frida in Department X, and you're in charge of business continuity with Department X. Frida is very good at filling in all the blanks. She fills in names and telephone numbers and long lists of equipment and references to the standard operating procedures, because that's how we're going to do what we normally do. And she takes this long document that she updates every 6 months. She shares it with the rest of the department. They don't really read it. Maybe they scan it, then they put it in a file somewhere, or they print it out and put it in the trunk of their car so they have it. Okay, so what? Is Department X ready to recover? And if you think maybe not, because Frida's just filling in a document and the department's not working to create the capabilities that they need, how do you have that discussion with senior management? You have a hunch that even though they've filled out every little part of ISO 22301, they're in no way ready to recover? Well, again, let's go back to resources, procedures, and competencies. And if we can measure those, we can start to have a discussion. So if we measure, let's start at the highest level. Let's put some hypothetical numbers here. Resources, let's say 50%. Let's say they've got about half of the things that they need to address the post-disaster situation. So they've got maybe laptops at home, but they don't have backup printers or check stock or whatever it is that they need as resources. Some yes, some no. Procedures, they haven't talked about what they're going to do. They don't understand their guiding principles. They don't know what their objectives are. They don't know what management expects of them. They'll figure it out eventually, but the procedures of how they're supposed to do and what they're supposed to do, not in terms of a long set of instructions, but those guiding principles, they don't know. Crisis competencies, they haven't talked about this, they haven't practiced this, they haven't been part of a real crisis. So, would they figure it out? Would they muddle through eventually? Sure. But are they ready to recover their services under adverse circumstances right now? Well, we can put some numbers to this and we can measure it. The average of those numbers is about 31% prepared to recover from disaster. Well, not quite, because preparedness is not the same thing as recoverability. And let's talk about an example so that we can unpack this a little bit. Imagine a manufacturing company, and in this hypothetical example, we'll take some very high artificial numbers. Let's say they know exactly what they would do in a post-disaster environment, right? They have all sorts of procedures, they've talked about them, and in fact, this particular manufacturing unit is made up entirely of Navy SEALs. They are practiced, they are prepared. These men and women eat crisis for breakfast. But there are no backup manufacturing facilities. There isn't a capital to be able to buy one or rent one or purchase one in a post-disaster environment. So think about this for a minute. Capabilities don't operate in silos. Missing gaps in capabilities in one area will negatively affect the other areas. And so unless the capabilities exist for all the resources, the procedures, and the competencies that are needed, there's going to be big gaps. And in an open-ended, non-linear, complex system, little gaps, little problems continue to feed back on themselves and create great big problems and gaps. Let's put some numbers to this. So, our hypothetical manufacturing example. No resources, but 100% procedures, 100% competencies, recoverability, 0. Okay? Why? Because we just talked about capabilities don't operate in silos. A manufacturing unit that doesn't have any manufacturing capabilities is not going to be able to manufacture. Let's go back to Department X. So resources, procedures, competencies, we multiply them together and we get a recoverability confidence index, what I'm calling a confidence index of 2.5%. That sounds about right to me. When I think about Frida's department and the fact that Frida is just filling out some templates and they're not practicing, they're not talking, they're not preparing, they aren't empowered, they don't have the resources that they need, what is their chance of recovering? Probably darn low. 2.5% sounds about right. Now with this, we can start to have some interesting discussions, and we're starting to run out of time, so I can't go into them. You'll have to start imagining them. But the difference, the gap, the delta between actual preparedness and what we need to have in terms of preparedness can be shown, can be measured, and now we can talk with leadership. And in fact, what is the difference between these two? Well, these are going to get cashed out in terms of loss of brand, services, money, time. As an organization struggles to deal with the post-disaster environment that they have not prepared for, it's going to cost time and money and brand and shareholders and stakeholders and etc. That's what the delta between required preparedness and actual preparedness means. We can start to measure this up, down, across, all over the place. As we have these scores, we can start to find where the problems are, and we can drill down into each of them. This makes business continuity planning a lot more simple. It's not a nebulous, confusing thing where I have to do all these very complicated things. It gets very simple. If HR doesn't have staffing, for example, that we have here, or they don't know how to communicate, like who do they call? How do they do it? They don't have a dark site. They don't have an alternate notification system. They don't have these things. They don't know how to reestablish these services. That's where we can start to plug those gaps. We can compare across silos of an organization, and we can count is absolutely not the right word. We can measure and come up with a recoverability confidence index across the entire organization. And now we have something to talk with leadership. Recoverability is not a matter of yes and no. We've been used to counting, and so much of ISO 22301 and BCI and good, professional practices are check the box. Did you do a BIA or did you not? Do you have a plan or not? Did you do an exercise or not? That doesn't matter. You can do these things and do them horribly. And in fact, my guess is those things don't really add a lot to preparedness and recoverability. What matters are the procedures, the resources, and the competencies in place to deal with the post-disaster environment. Now we're coming up on the 30-minute mark, so I'll do my best. This is where things get more complicated, and so far maybe complicated enough, but there's an entire framework that we can put behind these measures. What we have to know is that, okay, we're measuring resources, procedures, and competencies for, let's say, the HR department or payroll. But measuring them for what? In other words, how bad of a bad thing are we preparing for? And that's very important, because measurements for is HR prepared to deal with a 2-hour power outage versus is HR prepared to deal with the loss of power across the entire eastern seaboard for a week are very different things. Measurements have to come in what we call inside of the aperture, and I'll tell you about that. First of all, we need to talk about the losses, and we'll call those anticipated losses. So as we sit down, as we're planning with HR or payroll or steam generation or childcare, as we're planning with them, how bad of a thing are we planning for? So we need to look at the locations, the people, and the things in terms of losses. Are we talking about the location is gone? Like COVID-19, we really lost our locations for a long stretch of time. But think about the more normal things, the wildfires and the flooding and the power outages and all sorts of bad things that happen. So how much of a loss and how long of a loss, right? So loss of 10% of my staff over a few days is not the same as a loss of 90% of my staff over a month. So we have to set this aperture. What are we measuring? We know what we're measuring. Within what kind of context are we measuring these things? We have to be very clear here. And also restrictions. So let's think about options and opportunities at time of disaster. The more money that I have, or resources, the more time that I have, and the more minimal of my services I have to restore, the more options I have, the easier it is to recover. So we have to combine these two. This is our aperture. How bad is it going to be? And what are my resources, my options, my restrictions, right? So that's kind of a negative thing, but what are the restrictions that are limiting my choices? The less money, the less time, the more things I have to recover, the fewer options I have. So all measurements have to be made within this aperture. So we can really start to see this model come out, the capability and constraint model. So remember here in our triangle, we have two different triangles. We're measuring resources, procedures, and competencies, and we're measuring what we have and also what we need. Well, what we have and what we need for what? Well, for a disaster, an incident, an event that is going to cause losses of people, things, and locations. And we're also going to be limited by our time, our scope, and our cost. This sets the framework. And we have to be careful here when we're providing our measurements to management. Organizations, and what I've seen when we do the measurements, probably start out relatively simple. Maybe they pick one scenario that involves one type of loss to try it out. So, hey, the COVID-19, maybe it's going to get worse. Maybe the Delta variant or some other variant is getting even worse. Let's plan for a loss of staff. Okay, maybe we keep other things constant. So we have our resources, our things, our locations are okay, but our people are in real trouble. And what kind of money do we have for that? Now we can do that kind of measurement. And we can start to slice and dice against different kinds of scenarios. What does my organization look like in an event that takes out people? Or where people are okay, but it takes out all the locations? Or locations are okay? You get the idea. So this is the measurement piece. And we can go down and deep as much as possible. Think about resources, right? If I'm measuring resources, I can start at a high level with a categories of resources like, okay, laptops and software and vital records and those types of things. But I can get down and down and down and down. And I can go to a level of specificity and precision that I need to get to. How important are these measurements? In many cases, to start to find the gaps, the problems, to create the roadmap and the heat map for what's going on, I don't need a ton of detail, but I do need to know how bad of the thing is it that I'm planning for, what kinds of losses, what kinds of restrictions, and then what kinds of measures. Let's talk about some implications, because this is where you all might be very, very important to the future. Think about what this framework means. If we stop focusing on counting documents, start focusing on measuring real preparedness and recoverability, measuring the things that we know matter in a post-disaster environment. We can change the way we're writing and measuring and doing public policy. Where do we spend our money? If I have $10,000 and a few weeks to spend on business continuity with one department, where do I start to make these investments? Well, by measuring, we get an idea of where the gaps are and where the strengths are, and we can start to improve on those or double down on the strengths. We can start to get to business continuity as more of a science. As we start to, if we can measure things, if we can collect data, and then we can start to plug in artificial intelligence, data analytics, we can really start to figure out what is most important in a post-disaster environment. What are the things that matter most? Now look, we could measure this. Absolutely possible to start taking measures of preparedness before a disaster, or if we had to, right after a disaster, and then measure the impacts of the disaster and correlate the two. Right now, the model is our resources and procedures, the average of resources, procedures, and competencies. But we might get much more precise about that. It might turn out that resources are twice as important as crisis competencies. It might turn out the opposite. We don't know. We need to perform these measures before and after a disaster, an event, an incident. And look, we can also measure the impacts. I think my colleague Mark Armour is going to talk about this. We can take existing measures that organizations are already measuring, brand, customer satisfaction, how many phone calls came in after the disaster, how many ServiceNow tickets did I create, what does my brand look like in the marketing, what are my shareholders doing. We can measure both of those. What was in place prior to the disaster, what were the impacts, correlate those across industries, across all organizations, and we have turned business continuity into a science. No more arguing about what are the best methods and what are the best professional practices. We'll have proven practices, we'll have proven data. This is where you can play such an important role. Let us move away from counting things and deliverables to measuring and real empirical studies of what matters in the post-disaster environment. Easy to get a hold of me on LinkedIn and email. My colleague Mark Armour and I have a book about business continuity, adaptive business continuity. There are tools. The Readiness test is a tool that we have created specifically to measure preparedness and recoverability, automatically calculate the recoverability confidence index, etc., etc. And I'm working on a new book now on the reality of resilience. Thank you all so much for your time, and I appreciate it.